Thank you guys for making this special. I know maybe it's not easy to stay here and watch the match when it's pretty late, but...
Mirra Andreeva sends a warning to Bouzková, and the message was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a win on the scoreboard, it was a shift in tone, a change in balance, a moment where experience met fearlessness and blinked first. What happened on that court didn't end with the final point. It started a conversation the WTA can't stop having. Mirra Andreeva and Marie Bouzková arrived at this match from completely different places, not just in ranking or age, but in mindset. For Bouzková, this was familiar territory. Years on tour had taught her how to survive long rallies, how to frustrate opponents, how to grind matches down until patience ran out. She wasn't flashy, but she was reliable, the kind of player who stayed in matches by refusing to miss, by waiting for errors, by trusting experience over impulse. At 26, she had already built a reputation as someone who could trouble big names, especially when matches became physical and drawn out. For Andreeva, none of that mattered. At just 18, Mirra stepped onto the court carrying something far heavier than expectations: momentum. She wasn't playing like a teenager anymore. She wasn't reacting. She was dictating. Each tournament added another layer to her confidence, and each win reinforced the same message. She wasn't here to learn. She was here to take. Their paths had crossed before, and the pattern was already forming. Every time they met, Andreeva found a way through Bouzková's defenses, not by outlasting her, but by breaking the rhythm entirely, shortening points, taking risks early, refusing to play the long, patient game Bouzková needed. And that history hung quietly in the air before the first ball was even struck, because Bouzková knew what hadn't worked before, and Andreeva knew exactly why it had. The age gap made the matchup uncomfortable. One player fighting to protect her place in the upper tier of the tour, the other sprinting toward it with no hesitation. This wasn't just youth versus experience, it was certainty versus caution. Early on, Bouzková tried to impose control. Longer rallies, higher margins, slower tempo. She wanted the match to breathe, to settle, to feel familiar. And for a brief moment, it worked. She broke first. She showed resistance. She reminded everyone why she belonged here. But there was a subtle shift almost immediately. Andreeva didn't panic. She didn't rush. She absorbed the moment, reset, and then did something Bouzková couldn't stop. She raised the pace. Not recklessly, intentionally. Each return came back deeper. Each ground stroke landed closer to the lines. Each step inside the baseline felt like a challenge. It was the body language that told the real story. Bouzková began looking across the net more often. Andreeva didn't look back. She was already preparing for the next point, already visualizing the next strike. That contrast mattered. One player searching for solutions, the other convinced she already had them. This match wasn't framed as a rivalry before it started, but rivalries aren't always announced. Sometimes they reveal themselves in moments like this, when one player realizes the other isn't going away and might already be ahead. And somewhere between those early games, between the first resistance and the first unanswered surge, the dynamic shifted. This was no longer about whether Andreeva could challenge Bouzková. It was about whether Bouzková could stop what was coming. And that question would only grow louder as the match went on. The match didn't break all at once. It cracked slowly, and that made it worse. After the early exchange, after Bouzková briefly showed resistance, something changed in the rhythm of play. It wasn't a single winner or a dramatic rally that shifted control. It was repetition. Point after point, Mirra Andreeva began arriving to the ball earlier, taking it cleaner, redirecting it sharper. And with every successful strike, the court started to feel smaller for Bouzková. The turning point came quietly. Down a break, Andreeva didn't press, she recalibrated. She started targeting Bouzková's forehand with heavier depth, then suddenly flattened out the backhand down the line. The variation was deliberate. Bouzková thrives when she can predict patterns, when she can absorb pace and extend rallies. Andreeva refused to give her that comfort. What followed was a stretch of tennis that didn't just flip the set, it redefined the match. Games began slipping away from Bouzková not because she was playing poorly, but because she was being forced to play outside her identity. She was pulled forward, then pushed back. Wide angles dragged her off the court. Short balls were punished immediately. The rally she wanted never fully materialized. 7 games in a row. That number mattered, because in professional tennis, streaks like that don't happen by accident. They happen when one player has answers and the other has run out of questions. Andreeva's body language said everything. Calm between points, no fist pumps, no overreactions, just quiet execution. Every hold of serve felt faster than the last. Every break felt inevitable. Bouzková, meanwhile, began showing signs of strain. Longer pauses before serves, glances toward her box, a subtle tightening in her movement. These weren't signs of panic, they were signs of realization. She tried to slow the pace, she adjusted her return position, she even attempted to draw Andreeva into longer exchanges, hoping to wear her down mentally. But the response was ruthless. Andreeva shortened points even further. First strike tennis, early aggression, no hesitation. This wasn't reckless youth, this was control. By the time the first set slipped away, the scoreboard told a harsh truth, but the deeper message was even harsher. Bouzková hadn't been outworked, she'd been outgrown. The second set began with urgency from Bouzková. She stepped inside the baseline, tried to dictate more, tried to match the pace she had been avoiding, but chasing a player like Andreeva at her own speed is a dangerous choice, and it showed immediately. Errors crept in. Not wild ones, tight ones. The kind that come when timing is just a fraction off, when confidence starts to drain, when doubt whispers between points. Andreeva sensed it. She raised her level again. Returns landed deeper, angles widened, the ball came back faster than Bouzková expected, again and again, and soon the rallies weren't battles anymore. They were statements. Each break felt heavier than the last, not because of the scoreline, but because of what it represented. This wasn't a close match slipping away, this was a door closing. The crowd felt it too. The murmurs between points grew quieter. The applause became sharper, more reactive. There was no suspense about who was in control, only curiosity about how far Andreeva would take it. And she took everything. A 6-3, 6-1 finish doesn't just reflect dominance, it leaves questions behind, it forces reflection, it demands interpretation. For Bouzková, it was another reminder that this matchup had become uncomfortable, even dangerous. For Andreeva, it was something else entirely. It was a message. Not shouted, not celebrated, delivered with precision. Because when a teenager dismantles a seasoned professional this efficiently, it's no longer about one match. It's about hierarchy. And the warning had been sent, not just to Bouzková, but to anyone watching closely enough to understand what it meant. And the WTA was watching. The match ended quickly, but the echo lasted much longer, because what Mirra Andreeva did to Marie Bouzková wasn't just a technical victory, it was a psychological one. And in women's tennis, those linger. They get discussed in locker rooms. They shape future matchups before the first ball is even struck. For Andreeva, this wasn't about proving she belonged anymore. That debate was already over. This was about establishing boundaries, about letting a seasoned opponent know that familiarity wouldn't protect her, that experience wouldn't slow the wave that was coming. And the tennis world noticed. Analysts began pointing out how composed Andreeva looked under pressure, not just for her age, but in absolute terms. There was no sense of chaos in her game, no emotional swings, just clarity, purpose, efficiency. The kind of performance that feels rehearsed even when it's unfolding in real time. The warning wasn't delivered with words. It came through decisions, through how early she took the ball, through how often she changed direction, through how little she allowed Bouzková to breathe. This was not the style of a player still figuring things out. This was the style of someone who knows exactly who she is and who she's becoming. In her post-match reflections, Andreeva kept it simple. She spoke about staying aggressive, about trusting her instincts, about not letting the score line dictate her focus. The calmness of those comments only amplified the message. There was no shock in her voice, no disbelief, just confirmation. That confidence stirred debate. Some praised her maturity, others wondered whether the tour was ready for how fast she was progressing, and a few quietly questioned what this meant for players like Bouzková, reliable, hard-working, but suddenly caught in the crossfire of a generational shift. Because this wasn't the first time Andreeva had dismantled her. Patterns matter in tennis. 2 straight-set wins can be dismissed as coincidence. 3 start to feel deliberate. Each meeting had followed a similar script, Bouzková resisting early, Andreeva adjusting, then accelerating beyond reach. That repetition turned this match from an isolated result into a narrative. Fans began using a word that hadn't been attached to this pairing before: rivalry. Not because Bouzková had done anything wrong, not because of animosity, but because dominance invites tension, and tension invites response. Social media lit up with comparisons. Clips of Andreeva stepping inside the baseline circulated rapidly. Discussions followed about how her game seems designed to dismantle counterpunchers, how her timing and court positioning deny players like Bouzková the patience they rely on. The conversation subtly shifted. It stopped being about how well Andreeva was playing. It became about who could stop her. And in that context, Bouzkova's name kept coming up, not as a threat, but as a measuring stick, a test Andreeva had now passed decisively more than once. That's where the warning deepened, because when a young player consistently handles experienced professionals, it changes how future opponents prepare. They stop waiting for mistakes. They start second-guessing strategies. They press earlier than they should. Andreeva didn't just win a match, she altered perception. Bouzkova's silence after the loss spoke volumes. There were no dramatic gestures, no visible frustration, just a quiet exit, the kind that leaves room for reflection and perhaps discomfort. Because knowing you are outplayed is one thing, knowing you may not yet have an answer is another. This was the moment the matchup crossed a line. No longer a simple clash of styles, no longer a learning experience for the younger player. This was a warning delivered in full view of the tour, and it raised an uncomfortable question that lingered well beyond the final handshake. If this is how Mirra Andreeva handles players like Bouzková now, what happens when she faces them again with even more belief, even more power, and even less fear? Because rivalries aren't always born from hatred. Sometimes they're born from inevitability, and this one had just announced itself. When the match ended, the noise didn't disappear, it shifted. The scoreboard froze, but the conversation kept moving. And for Marie Bouzková, that may have been the hardest part, because losses like this don't fade quietly. They follow you. They get replayed, dissected, remembered, especially when the opponent is young enough to represent the future. There was no public outburst, no visible anger, no excuses offered. Bouzkova's reaction was restrained, professional, almost too calm. But in tennis, silence can speak louder than protest. It leaves space for others to fill in the blanks. And they did. Commentators began framing the result not as a bad day, but as a bad matchup. A stylistic problem that Bouzková hadn't solved and might not yet know how to solve. The discussion wasn't cruel, but it was pointed. Questions surfaced about adaptability, about whether consistency alone is enough in a tour increasingly dominated by early aggression and fearless ball striking. Fans noticed the pattern too. Every time Bouzková tried to settle into her rhythm, Andreeva disrupted it. Every time she attempted to extend rallies, they were cut short. It led to an uncomfortable conclusion. This wasn't about effort or form, it was about control, and Bouzková hadn't had it. That realization stings more than a close loss ever could. Online discussions turned analytical, then speculative. Some defended Bouzková, pointing out her resilience, her work ethic, her ability to frustrate other top players. Others were less forgiving, suggesting that this matchup exposed a ceiling, not just in tactics, but in how quickly she could adjust under pressure. Meanwhile, Andreeva's maiden dominated the conversation, not because she celebrated loudly, not because she disrespected her opponent, but because she looked untouched. That composure unsettled people. There's something unnerving about a teenager who doesn't seem impressed by the moment, who treats experience as irrelevant, who plays with the calm authority of someone twice her age. It forces observers to recalibrate expectations, and that recalibration can feel threatening, especially for players who have spent years earning their place. For Bouzková, the aftermath wasn't about defending herself publicly. It was about internal reckoning, about asking the difficult questions every professional athlete eventually faces. Do I need to change? Do I need to evolve? Or was this simply one opponent who exposes a weakness too clearly to ignore? Those questions don't get answered overnight. They linger in practice sessions. They surface before future draws. They resurface when names appear on the scoreboard. And that's where the tension deepened. Because the next time Bouzková sees Andreeva's name across the net, she won't just be facing a player, she'll be facing memory, a reminder of how quickly control slipped away, how powerless the usual solutions felt. The fallout wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, and that made it heavier. Because rivalries don't always explode in public arguments or heated exchanges. Sometimes they grow in silence, fed by unanswered questions and unfinished business. And for Bouzková, this loss didn't just close a chapter, it opened a problem she may have to confront again, whether she's ready or not. At some point, every rivalry reaches a moment where emotion gives way to reality, where the noise settles, the replays stop looping, and the truth becomes impossible to dodge. For Mirra Andreeva and Marie Bouzková, this was that moment. Because beneath the reactions, the debates, and the labels being attached, one fact stood unchallenged. This matchup had tilted decisively, and that forced a harder conversation. For Bouzková, the issue wasn't effort. It never was. Her intensity didn't drop, her movement didn't disappear, her commitment to every point remained intact. What changed was the effectiveness of her tools. The patterns that had worked against so many opponents simply didn't disrupt Andreeva. That's not a flaw, it's a matchup problem. And matchup problems demand evolution. Analysts began breaking down the tactical gap. Andreeva's willingness to step inside the baseline early robbed Bouzková of time. Her ability to redirect pace eliminated the long rallies Bouzková thrives on. Even when points extended, Andreeva dictated the final strike more often than not. That forced Bouzková into a decision she couldn't postpone any longer: adapt or accept. Because continuing to play the same way against Andreeva would likely lead to the same result. But adaptation at this level isn't simple. It requires risk. It demands discomfort. It often means losing first before winning later. And for a player whose career has been built on consistency and control, that shift can feel like stepping into unfamiliar territory. On the other side of the net, Andreeva faced a different truth. With every dominant performance, expectations rise, and dominance invites scrutiny. The tennis world doesn't just ask how good you are, it asks how sustainable it is, how you'll respond when opponents finally adjust, when the element of surprise disappears. Andreeva's challenge moving forward won't be proving she can dismantle Bouzková again. It will be proving she can do it when Bouzková refuses to play the same match. Because rivalries evolve. The first chapter often favors the disruptor, the second favors the adapter, the third decides everything. That's what makes this pairing compelling. There's no animosity, no controversy born from words, just a competitive tension fueled by unanswered questions. Can Bouzková add more aggression without losing her identity? Can Andreeva maintain her clarity when the script changes? And when these two meet again, will the outcome feel inevitable or earned all over again? That uncertainty is the heartbeat of a rivalry, not drama for drama's sake, but the quiet pressure of knowing you'll see each other again, knowing that the last match is never truly the last word. For now, the truth stands plainly. Andreeva has control. She holds the psychological edge. She dictates the narrative. But tennis has a way of humbling certainty. The question isn't whether Bouzková can respond, it's when and how. Because the moment she does, this stops being a warning. and becomes a fight. Rivalries are never born overnight. They emerge slowly in moments of tension, in battles of will, in points that feel bigger than the scoreline. And for Mirra Andreeva and Marie Bouzková, that moment has arrived. It wasn't in the roar of the crowd. It wasn't in a dramatic outburst. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as Andreeva moved across the court with unshakable calm, and Bouzková realized she was being measured, tested, outmaneuvered. In that quiet, the seeds of a rivalry were sown, one that may not only define their careers, but also mark a generational shift in women's tennis. Andreeva's warning was clear. She is here to challenge the established order. She doesn't wait for permission, and she doesn't yield to reputation. Her matches are statements, her victories are declarations, and her presence on court carries a message that resonates far beyond the baseline. She's young, yes, but that youth is paired with precision, confidence, and an instinct that makes her feel like a player much older than her years. For Bouzková, the challenge is existential. Not existential in the dramatic sense, but in the professional reality of tennis. The sport is unforgiving. A single loss can be analyzed, dissected, and remembered forever. And when that loss comes at the hands of a rising star, it forces reflection, strategy adjustment, and sometimes humility. Bouzková must now ask herself hard questions. What worked before? What failed now? And most importantly, how can I prepare for the inevitable rematch? The broader significance of this matchup is undeniable. Fans are already framing it as a clash of generations, the fearless youth testing the mettle of experienced skill. Analysts debate the potential outcomes of future encounters. Social media buzzes with clips of Andreeva's sharp footwork, Bouzkova's resilient attempts to regain control, and the tactical moments that could define the next chapter. Each observer sees the rivalry in their own way, but all recognize one thing. This story is far from over. And therein lies the beauty of sport. Rivalries don't need anger or hatred to thrive. They need tension, potential, and uncertainty. They grow in moments of dominance and in moments of adjustment. They are fueled by unanswered questions and by anticipation. What happens next? Can Bouzková reclaim her footing? Will Andreeva maintain her rising trajectory? How will both players evolve in response to each other? The Adelaide match was more than a scoreline. It was the opening chapter of a narrative that could span seasons, tournaments, and defining moments. It was a warning, yes, but also an invitation to fans, to analysts, and to the players themselves that the game is constantly evolving and the future is always being written in real time. As the tour moves forward, one thing is certain. When Mirra Andreeva and Marie Bouzková meet again, it won't just be a match. It will be a statement, a test of adaptation, courage, and endurance. And while Andreeva may have sent the first warning, the rivalry has only just begun. Who will rise to meet it? Who will bend? And who will break? And as fans, we are left with that question, waiting, watching, and anticipating every moment. Because this is more than a clash of players. This is the birth of a rivalry that could define a generation. Subscribe to the channel to witness the next chapter in this unfolding story, because this is one rivalry you won't want to miss.